She never suspected anything at first because their life looked exactly like the kind of life people admire from the outside: stable, predictable, and carefully built over years of shared routines. And every morning followed the same pattern: coffee brewed before sunrise, quiet conversations about work, small plans for the weekend, and the comfort of knowing what to expect. And it was precisely this normality that convinced her nothing could be wrong, because betrayal rarely announces itself loudly. It settles in quietly, disguising itself as habit. And as she moved through her days trusting the man she believed she knew completely, she never imagined that a single insignificant detail, something so small it barely registered at the time, would eventually unravel everything she thought was true. And standing in their kitchen one ordinary evening, watching him talk casually about his day, she felt no fear, no doubt, only the calm certainty of someone who believes her life is exactly what it appears to be, unaware that the truth was already moving closer, waiting patiently for the right moment to surface. The first crack appeared in a moment so ordinary that she almost dismissed it entirely, because nothing about that afternoon felt dramatic or suspicious, and yet it stayed with her in a quiet, persistent way she could not explain, as she reached for his jacket hanging by the door and felt a vibration in the pocket, soft and brief, like something trying not to be noticed. And when she pulled out his phone to bring it to him, the screen lit up just enough for her eyes to catch a fragment of a message. Not a full sentence, not even a name she recognized immediately, just a few words that didn't belong to the life she knew. And although she handed the phone back without comment, smiling automatically as if nothing had happened, the feeling it left behind followed her through the evening, growing heavier with every casual word he spoke, because she realized then how trust works, how it convinces you to ignore discomfort, to explain away questions before they fully form. And as she lay awake later that night, listening to him breathe beside her, she understood that doubt does not arrive as panic. It arrives as awareness, subtle and unsettling, quietly asking you to look closer at what you have always accepted as truth. From that moment on, she began to notice things she had never questioned before, not because they were new, but because her attention had changed. And suddenly the small inconsistencies stood out against the rhythm of their daily life. The late meetings that had no clear explanation, the phone turned face down on the table, the pauses in his speech when she asked simple questions. And none of it was dramatic enough to demand confrontation, yet together it formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. And as she moved through her days, pretending nothing had shifted, she felt the strain of carrying suspicion alone, wondering how long a person could live between what they see and what they want to believe. And when she caught her reflection in the mirror one evening, she barely recognized the woman staring back, alert, guarded, quietly preparing herself for a truth she did not yet know, but could already feel approaching. Understanding that betrayal does not always begin with discovery, it begins the moment trust starts to feel like a risk. She tried to convince herself that noticing changes did not mean imagining problems, yet the more she paid attention, the harder it became to ignore how carefully he managed his presence around her, choosing his words with unusual precision, reacting too quickly when she touched his phone, and offering explanations before she ever asked for them. And this quiet defensiveness unsettled her more than any obvious lie could have, because it suggested preparation rather than innocence. And as days passed, she found herself replaying conversations in her head late at night, analyzing tones and pauses, questioning moments she once trusted without hesitation. And in doing so, she realized how betrayal begins long before it is confirmed. It begins when one person is forced to become an observer instead of a partner. And standing in their kitchen one evening, watching him laugh at something on his screen before quickly hiding it, she felt a tightening in her chest, not from anger, but from the growing awareness that whatever truth waited beneath the surface, it was already changing her, teaching her to protect herself from answers she was not yet ready to hear. By the end of the week, the tension inside her had become impossible to ignore. Not because she knew the truth, but because living without it felt heavier than facing whatever waited on the other side. And as she moved through her routines, folding laundry, answering emails, preparing dinner, she felt as if she were acting in her own life rather than living it, carefully maintaining appearances while her thoughts spiraled quietly beneath the surface. And when she finally found herself alone with his laptop one evening, not out of suspicion but exhaustion, she hesitated longer than she expected, aware that crossing this invisible line would change everything. Yet also knowing that once trust begins to fracture, avoidance only deepens the damage. And as the screen lit up and familiar folders appeared, her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and resolve, because she understood in that moment that seeking the truth was not about accusing him, but about reclaiming clarity for herself, even if what she discovered would force her to confront a reality she had spent years believing could never exist in her life. What she found was not dramatic at first glance. No obvious messages or clear confessions waiting to be discovered, but instead a series of small, carefully hidden details that felt far more deliberate than an open mistake. Calendar entries that didn't align with his explanations, deleted conversations that left behind faint traces, and email drafts that were never sent yet carried an intimacy she had not shared with him in a long time. And as she pieced these fragments together, she realized how much effort it takes to maintain a secret life, how betrayal is often built not on passion alone, but on planning, discipline, and repeated choices to deceive. And sitting there in the quiet glow of the screen, she felt a strange calm replace the anxiety she had carried for days, because uncertainty had been worse than knowing. And even though the full truth was still incomplete, she understood that this moment marked a turning point. The instant when she stopped being someone who waited for reassurance and became someone preparing to confront a reality that could no longer be ignored, no matter how painful it might become. She closed the laptop slowly, not because she was finished, but because her mind needed space to catch up with what her eyes had already seen. And as the room fell back into silence, she felt the weight of realization settle deep inside her, heavy but oddly grounding, because now her fear had direction, and with it came a clarity she hadn't felt in days. And as she sat there replaying everything she had uncovered, she understood that betrayal rarely reveals itself in one undeniable moment. It reveals itself through accumulation, through patterns that only make sense once you stop looking for excuses. And when she heard his footsteps approaching down the hallway, her first instinct was not anger or confrontation, but restraint, because she knew that once she spoke, there would be no returning to the comfort of not knowing. And in that pause, standing between discovery and confession, she realized how profoundly this experience had changed her, turning trust into caution and love into something that now required truth in order to survive. She chose not to confront him that night, not because she doubted what she had seen, but because she wanted to understand the full shape of the truth before giving it a voice. And as they sat together later on the couch, watching a show neither of them was truly paying attention to, she studied him quietly, noticing how relaxed he seemed, how easily he laughed, how convincingly normal everything appeared. And this contrast unsettled her more than anger ever could, because it revealed how deeply deception had been woven into their everyday life. And as he casually reached for her hand, squeezing it in a familiar gesture of affection, she felt a strange distance open inside herself, not physical but emotional, as if part of her had already stepped away to protect itself. And in that moment, she understood that betrayal does not only break trust between two people, it fractures the version of reality you believed you were sharing, forcing you to question not just the other person, but your own perceptions, instincts, and memories. And sitting there beside him, outwardly calm and inwardly unraveling, she realized that the hardest part was not discovering the lie, but continuing to live inside it while preparing herself for the moment it would finally be exposed. The next day unfolded with an almost cruel normality, as if the world had decided to test her endurance by refusing to acknowledge the storm growing inside her. And while she went through meetings, errands, and small conversations, she felt disconnected from everything around her, carrying the weight of knowledge that demanded action yet offered no clear path forward. And every time her phone buzzed with a message from him asking how her day was going, she felt the tension tighten in her chest because each casual question now sounded like part of a performance she could no longer fully believe in. And as the afternoon stretched on, she found herself rehearsing different versions of the confrontation in her mind, imagining his reactions, the denials, the justifications, the apologies that might follow. And through all these imagined outcomes, one truth remained constant, that whatever he said, the innocence of their relationship was already gone. And by the time she returned home that evening, standing once again in the familiar space they had built together, she understood that the coming conversation would not simply reveal his betrayal, it would redefine who she was willing to be in the face of it. That evening, as the house filled with the familiar sounds of routine, dishes clinking, water running, the quiet hum of shared space, she felt an almost surreal calm settle over her, the kind that arrives when a decision has already been made deep inside, even if the words have not yet been spoken. And while he talked about his day, unaware or pretending to be, she listened differently now, catching the subtle pauses, the practiced ease, the way he avoided certain details, and it became clear to her how carefully he had learned to manage two versions of himself. And as they sat down across from each other, the space between them felt charged with everything she had discovered and everything she was about to reveal. And in that moment, she understood that confrontation was not about proving his guilt, but about reclaiming her voice, because silence had already cost her peace. And as she took a slow breath, preparing to speak, she realized that whatever happened next would mark the end of the life she once trusted, and the beginning of something uncertain, but finally honest. She finally spoke when the silence between them became heavier than any accusation, her voice calm but steady, carrying the weight of everything she had held back for days. And as she asked him simple questions about his schedule, about the messages she had seen, about the gaps that no longer made sense, she watched his expression change in subtle stages, confusion giving way to caution, and caution slowly hardening into defensiveness. And it was in those moments, before any clear denial or explanation, that she felt the deepest confirmation of all, because honesty does not need preparation. And as he struggled to respond, offering fragments of stories that failed to align, she realized how much energy deception demands, how exhausting it must be to constantly protect a version of reality that cannot survive daylight. And standing there in the space they had once called safe, she felt both grief and strength rise within her, understanding that this conversation was no longer about uncovering details, but about acknowledging a fundamental break in trust. And as his words trailed off into silence, she knew with absolute certainty that whatever truths remained unspoken, the relationship they had known could not continue unchanged. The room felt different after the truth began to surface, as if the walls themselves were listening, holding on to every word that had been spoken and every silence that followed. And as he finally admitted what she had already known in her bones, that the connection had started innocently, that it hadn't meant to cross certain lines until it did, she felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow wash over her, because confirmation, even painful, carries a clarity a doubt never allows. And as he spoke about loneliness, about feeling unseen, about choices made without fully understanding their consequences, she listened not to defend or argue, but to understand how two people could slowly drift into separate realities while sharing the same space. And in doing so, she realized that betrayal is rarely about a single moment of weakness. It is about a series of decisions made quietly, each one easier than the last. And standing there, facing him, she felt the final pieces of her former life fall into place, not as something to be repaired, but as something to be acknowledged, accepted, and eventually released. Because truth, once spoken, does not ask permission to change everything. The aftermath of his confession settled slowly, not with shouting or chaos, but with a heavy stillness that made every movement feel deliberate. And as they stood facing each other, she became aware of how much strength it took to remain composed, to listen without interrupting, to allow the truth to exist without immediately trying to control its outcome. And while he spoke about regret and confusion, about not knowing how to stop once everything had begun, she felt a quiet shift inside herself, because for the first time since suspicion had entered her life, she was no longer searching for answers. She was deciding what to do with them. And in that moment, she understood that betrayal forces a choice long before anyone is ready. A choice between clinging to what was familiar and stepping into uncertainty with self-respect intact. And as she looked at him, seeing not just the man she loved, but the one who had chosen to deceive her, she realized that healing would not come from explanations or promises, but from the courage to redefine her life on her own terms, even as that meant walking away from everything she had once believed was unbreakable.